let's define a little bit the necessary ingredients for a DAO to be called a DAO. What's different between a DAO and a chat community? What do we really need to have in the mix to actually call it a DAO?
I mean, I think this is kind of a spectrum, right? Because you have DAOs that are like completely decentralized. All the decisions are on chain. All of the people are distributed. Some of them don't even have like a company associated with them. And all of the treasury is managed on chain, all the way down to more centralized DAOs where it's mostly just getting community feedback, all the way to like NFT DAOs where it's just like they're calling it a DAO, but it's really just like a trait. And so like I think you kind of have to get at the core. It's like a decentralized autonomous organization, right? So I think the super centralized NFT DAOs, well, one, the NFT trait DAO is not a DAO, right? Because it's not an organization. There's nothing really happening there. So I think you have to hit, all three aspects of it, right? It has to be at least making a good attempt at being decentralized. It has to be somewhat autonomous, and it has to actually be an organization with a goal that is doing something, not just existing.
Some kind of value adding, some kind of profit making. Do you think it's important to have such a goal in the end?
I honestly don't know that it needs to be profit seeking, right? Like it can just be fun, and the goal of the organization is fun. Like if you made a DAO and its whole purpose was just like, we're going to meet up at Breakpoint and plan events, it doesn't have to make money. It just has to be organized.
I like this interpretation because it doesn't it doesn't exclude completely NFT DAOs, but it does exclude like an NFT trait DAO, which DAO.
Yeah, and like it's a spectrum, right? The NFT trait DAO it can potentially turn itself into an actual DAO, but like when it's just a group chat on Twitter, it's not like.
But do you think the on-chain element is important?
It depends. Are you managing on-chain assets?
Transparency.
Yeah, I mean, are you gathering votes and stuff? I would say yes, especially if you want to call it like decentralized. It's important to do that. Otherwise, you're just an autonomous organization, which is also okay. You don't have to use the buzzwords. I feel like people just add, like, they say it's a DAO even when it's not actually decentralized, because it's like it's a buzzword at this point. We are
like a meme.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's the marketing.
And you can't, it's hard for somebody to call you out on it too. Like, it's like, we're a DAO. Well, no, you're not. And then it's like, you've got this mountain of precedent from so many other people have gone away with calling themselves DAOs, where it's like, okay, don't get into this argument. There was one, we had another conversation around this where somebody had suggested that a concert could be a DAO, where, you can get the entire audience to chant a word during a song. And because you can coordinate this activity, that can be considered a DAO.
I will politely disagree with this. I will politely disagree with this interpretation, but I hear you.
I think one of the ingredients that's essential in any kind of maybe organization is some sort of ledger. Even if it's on-chain or off-chain, like you could hypothetically have an off-chain decentralized organization, but as long as somehow people are able to interact with this ledger freely, permissionlessly. Like maybe there's a rock that we all go to and we put our entries there and we all know that it's our entry and no one else's. And
no, I think all the points you guys touched are important because it sets the foundation for our discussion here. Like being on the same page on what exactly is a DAO, what exactly is a governance layer, what are the requirements in order to make it valuable enough for organizations to actually set up on that environment. I think it's an important foundational question in order for us to dive into what Helium is building, to dive into different approaches in building those governance layers and the general interaction between communities on that governance layers. on that governance layer.
Yeah, I mean, I think the definition is super elusive because it's still so early. Like nobody actually has the right solution, so everybody is experimenting with different things. And so, like my definition of a DAO is going to be different than Mango's definition of a DAO because it's just still. It's like a primordial ooze, right? Like we need, things to crawl out of that ooze before we can define them.
And so far, maybe I'm wrong on this one, and maybe I haven't been paying attention to the Solana DAO space enough. But from what I've understood so far, we haven't seen a lot of protocol DAOs happening on Solana, where protocol upgrades are solely happening via DAO votes, and contracts are then not non-upgradable without DAO consensus. Where we've seen that on Ethereum, we haven't seen that on Solana.
Yeah,
We've
I
seen
mean, I
only
think there's
one kind of DAOs.
I think there's kind of a healthy dose of paranoia there. If you actually govern the program with you physically govern it on chain with the DAO, you are at risk of particular kinds of attacks where people can, buy a bunch of votes and then use that to, mint themselves an unlimited amount of tokens or do whatever, mayhem that you want. So like Helium, for example, our smart contracts are basically governed by the DAO, but on chain, they're governed by a multi-sig that is run by the Helium Foundation, and the Helium Foundation just does whatever the DAO tells us to do mostly.
So you use the DAO for polling to get the opinions of the community, and then you take it upon yourselves to execute that poll.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a little more than polling, right? Because it's not like we're like, oh, we're gonna get your feedback and then we're not gonna do it. Really, the only reason that we would not do something is if it was like literally illegal for us to do so. But that tends to happen before something can even go up for proposal. Like a proposal won't go to voting until it's kind of been cleared by legal. So if something gets voted on, it is going to get done. So in effect, like, you could argue that our smart contracts are governed by the DAO, but there's this multi-sig that's in charge of actually doing it. But that means like, there's a human between, the big red button that could destroy everything and the DAO voting, which is, it's important because Helium has just switched to V tokens, right? We've just introduced new forms of governance. So how are we to know that somebody can't just go and, take a bunch of tokens and lock them up for 4 years and like actually do a very damaging vote for themselves to, do something dangerous? But this is why it's super elusive, the definition of a DAO. It's like, well, your smart contracts aren't actually governed on chain. And it does just look like polling. And this is why it's so hard to build DAO tooling too, because it's like what Helium needs is different than what Mango needs is different than what Dean's List needs. And, I think people have gotten into trouble trying to build like a one size fits all solution because it's still so, every organization is just so damn different.
Yeah, I mean, so Noah, you've brought this new governance platform now with the modular thinking, which I think is what you were alluding to now, that there really can't be a one size fits all. Can you share some of that thinking, like the pros and cons, like some of the trade-offs in that?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like, an analogy that makes sense. I guess maybe the best way to describe it is like, Realms is this like fully loaded Mercedes Sprinter van, which is like great and fits most use cases, but we need a bicycle to go through the streets of Europe. And like the van's going to get stuck. One size fits all solutions are very tricky when it comes to DAO governance. What I really like about Realms is that I can just go into the user interface and I can like just in a few clicks go and create my DAO by Realms' definition of a DAO, which was kind of shaped by, Mango's definition of a DAO and a couple of the earlier DAOs on Solana, right? And it just works. The problem is once you start going off-roading even a little bit, I want a different quorum mechanism, right? Like I don't want greater than 50%. So in Helium's case, it was we need a super majority, so 66% or more need to vote yes. And we also need, a minimum vote weight on the vote for it to be considered valid. That's just something that you can't do right now in Realms. There's a pull request open to SPL governance to do it, but it's not supported yet. Or things like multiple choice voting. Or another thing is you want your voting to be different. So like Realms out of the box is really great support for token voting and NFT voting. But if you want to do V tokens or your own flavor of V tokens, well, you have to go make your own smart contract, which is kind of to be expected. But then getting support in the UI, you have to go kind of like plug into this central UI that is Realms and try to add your plugin, which it just gets more complicated the more people who have plugins, right? And the UI gets heavier and heavier because the problem is like, these decentralized organizations, like as they evolve, they evolve like governments do. Like not everyone's using the US House and Senate system. There are parliamentaries, and even amongst parliamentary governments, they're all slightly different. It's really hard to make a one size fits all solution. And that's kind of what modular governance was like, okay, we're going to not do that. Like it was, kind of in essence, the idea of solving a problem by just not solving it. Like
it's definitely faster too, right? Like you don't have to load all of the van, right? Like the van has so many things with it, and that changes the user experience. You can custom make the DAO exactly with the components you need it for the streets of Europe, as you put it. I think that's also another one of those advantages you get over a modular design.
Yeah, and I think that the target audience is different, right? When you're talking about Realms, the target audience is someone non-technical who wants to go create a DAO and just get it really easily. When you're talking about like modular governance, the target audience is organizations who have the resourcing to hire a dev to go create something custom for them. Like you're not getting a website out of the box. Somebody has to go build you a website. Now we're, doing the best we can to make sure there's a ton of hooks and the SDK is really clean. So that you can do this. But what we found was that wasn't a goal of Realms, or maybe it was, but it wasn't, wasn't executed on for whatever reason. It's not very easy to build on top of Realms. The SDK is kind of difficult to work with. If we wanted to go build our own UI on top of Realms, it's not particularly easy.
To also speak about what I think is a benefit of a monolithic build is attack vectors. You have less of an attack surface because it's one program that you audit once, and you can freeze it a little easier than you can with modular design.
I would actually say the opposite is true. So it is really, really hard, one, to audit a monolithic smart contract because it does so much. You have to make sure that everything that it does is audited, and two, it's impossible to freeze it because these things they tend to snowball, right? Like as it gets more and more responsibility, it also picks up more and more authorities, and once something has the authority, it's really hard to move that authority around, and so they snowball. If it has a lot of responsibility now, it will tend to pick up more responsibility, and you can't freeze something that you expect to get more responsibility. Like, oh shit, I can't add an endpoint now to add this authority. And because it's so large, it's very hard to reason about. So that was actually one of the goals with modular governance, was like, I saw what the squads guys do and how they freeze things, and I love it. That's why we use squads. I was like, wait, V3 is immutable. You guys can't touch our programs via like your upgrade authority. And they're like, yeah, no, we can't do anything. I'm like, that's great. That's exactly what I want. Realms, you get around this by just deploying your own program, your own version of SPL Gov. But yeah, I loved that. But obviously you can't really do that with SPL Gov because it's too large. So these contracts, the goal was, let's make it so small that it's so easy to reason about that we can be relatively sure that it's done. Like when it's done, it's done. Like this proposal contract, dead simple, probably, within a couple years, we can just freeze it because it's done. And because it's all designed modularly, it doesn't preclude us from going and creating a proposal V2 or a state controller V2 or a vote controller V2, because the contracts were kind of originally built to just be one gear in a big system of gears. So it's okay to replace it. And that was kind of the goal. That was one of the goals. The other goal was being able to, experiment with more different kinds of governance.
I really like this approach. It feels like you can upgrade the modules. You can take offline the modules and freeze them without having to disrupt the whole DAO ecosystem.
Correct. And we're, like hindsight is 2020. SPL Gov was built, I think, even before Anchor. That was
Yes.
like the best of DAOs as we knew it then. The only reason like I knew to go build it this way is because I have a lot of experience building on Realms or on SPL Gov, and I know exactly where the weak points are. Like I knew exactly what was, hard. And I have the hindsight of going and seeing so many DAOs, start with this one click thing and then realize, oh, actually we need to like do something different. And in the past, how that's been supported is when somebody needs to do something different, the feature just gets added to SPL Gov and Realms. But now, like, the thing, it looks like a mech with like 30 machine guns in different directions, and it's like, I don't need that. But I kind of have to take it with me.
Is there any design where a monolithic approach makes sense?
I think monolithic approach usually makes sense first. You talk about like startup methodology. Most people don't start super modular because you don't actually know where the lines are drawn. And the only way you get to the point where you know where those lines are drawn is through pain. Right? So like I would not have been able to design modular governance the way that we designed it 2 years ago. I just wouldn't have. But having worked with Realms and, worked with SPL Gov and seen all the DAOs that came through, I kind of have an idea of where the lines are drawn. Like I knew right off the bat, the first thing people are going to want to do is customize the way voting happens. And the second thing people are going to want to do is they're going to want to customize the workflow. And third thing they're going to want to do is customize the quorums. You don't necessarily know that when you go out and build something. So if you try to build it modular at first, you're just going to have like, you're trying to build a system of gears and you're going to have gears just flying off everywhere because like, oh crap, I don't know if we needed that one. I think it's a healthy combination of both.
To dive into that analogy just a bit more, because I'm really curious about like voter states, the voter control, the state control as well. There's so many different scenarios to use these things, and I think it would be really fun, like dive into like the different ways you can play with them. I want to try to understand that gear analogy where things pop off. Like, what's the worst that could happen if you had gone towards a modular design a year earlier in your experience, like not really knowing the lines as you put it out? Like,
basically dependency hell, right? All of these contracts, they kind of have lines between them. Like you can kind of imagine it like a graph on a whiteboard, and you're trying to minimize where the lines are. It's called domain driven design, but you don't want to have a hairball effectively. But if you take something like this and you keep adding requirements over time, you get this one requirement and you're like, well, the only way to solve this one requirement is to add a line between these two things that didn't have a line before. And so before you know it, you end up with a hairball where all of these contracts, like the state that the contracts are in right now is I can easily shit can any one of them and nobody will care. But if it calcifies more and you keep adding more features to it, eventually I'm not going to be able to make a proposal V2 because proposal V1 does too much and too many people depend on it.
does it start to look like does it start to become monolithic in that approach, or?
It's like gardening. Like you have to be very, very careful about how you manage and garden these things. And it's a fun exercise in engineering architecture. Is all I can say.
I love that we've got snowballs and we've got hairballs. That's a great way to think about things.
And we're for sure haven't arrived in the end finalized recipe that we know what exactly DAOs need and when they'll need it. I think it's still an experiment, and going modular and being able to update specific things, upgrade and create version second and third versions, I think is extremely important. But it only happened through pain. It only happened because we saw what are the default settings on Realms, because we saw the pain points of other DAOs trying to make their own network states. So I see it's a natural evolution. Do you think can a monolithic and the modular governance layer work together, or one replaces the other?
I like to think that the modular one, right? Like I think it's always going to do a better job of getting people who are non-technical and just want a DAO right now. Like I think one-click DAO creation is just it's a non-goal of modular governance. And that's another, you talk about trade-offs of monolith versus modular. Is when it's modular and you have all these different plugins and stuff, it's like, well, how many people want to go build their own car in their garage? Some of us do. And Helium does, but does Dean's List want to go build their own car in the garage? I don't know. So that, I think they definitely coexist because there is a market for heavily customized DAO tooling. But equally there is a market for, I don't want to worry about any of this. And so what's interesting is what I think will happen is we'll start with, so we started right in the beginning with modular or with monolithic, because it was like, I'm going to make all these decisions for you. The goal, I think, of, was it Solana Labs or Solana Foundation who built SPL Gov? I'm not sure. But the goal was like, hey, we need more DAOs on Solana. We need a one-click solution where you can just go build a DAO. And so they did that, but obviously it didn't hit all of their requirements. Now, this next evolution is, we come out here with this modular solution and we're like, go crazy, experiment, do whatever you want. People are going to experiment. Some things are going to work. Some things are going to fail miserably. And what I bet happens in the like long tail future in like 4 or 5 years from now, maybe, or even 2 years, because 6 months in crypto is like 10 years outside, is someone's going to use modular governance to find a form of voting that works really, really effing well. And then they're going to turn that into a monolith that's a one-click DAO creation. Like it'll go back.
Yeah,
and you see
it
this
is
in,
to cater to all requirements.
yeah, and you
So
see this in
basically
Web too. People like it literally depends on like the 2-year period whether or not people are telling you should be building modular APIs or monolithic APIs. It just goes back and forth because it takes you have like a generation that deals with the hell that is monoliths, and they're like, I'm never going back to that again. And then they go and build a bunch of modular stuff, and the new people come on and they're like, this is hell. I'm going back to monoliths. And it just like it just TikToks.
Makes me think of like Apple versus Android. It makes me think of like MySpace versus Facebook. Like it's these kind of like design decisions that I don't want to have to overly think about these things. Like imagine trying to be a DAO expert on all of the different templates of a modular design. It'd be crazy. Like the theory you have to go through, like right now, it's hard enough explaining quorum to people and proposal thresholds. Then imagine it's like, well, look, with this design, you can look at these tokens. And if it's a Tuesday, those tokens have double the voting power. But wait, if you also have this NFT with that plugin, like it can get very, if there's not this kind of like standard understanding of voting and governance, you start to have very, like pockets of experts, right? Where this person's only an expert in this kind of governance and has no idea about any other type of stuff.
But I think it's, it's kind of a frog in boiling water type of thing. Like these governance systems tend to get more complex the more people that you're governing. And so you're talking about governing a small town of 12 people. It's really easy. Everybody just votes on everything. You get up to 100 people, not everybody can vote on everything. And so you start forming sub-organizations, and then eventually you get systems as complex as the US government, where you have the House and the Senate and checks and balances and courts, and you have states, and the states have power. In fact, actually Helium is kind of hitting the US government inflection point right now, which is super interesting, where there's the Helium DAO, the network HNT, and then there are these sub networks, IoT and mobile, and they're kind of like states. And there's actually arguments going on about what are the power of the states versus the power of the federal government, which is like super fascinating. And there's
3 tokens, right? There's 3 different groups.
Yeah, well, there's the one token HNT, which is kind of the parent, and then
is that the federal government?
That is the federal government in this case. And then you've got IoT and mobile, which are like the states. And it's like, do the states have more power? Does the federal government have more power? And this is exactly the type of question that, you start to even try to answer it, and Realms breaks down. Realms just, we're outgrown it, right? We're doing crazy shit, and we need more complicated tooling or really more modular tooling that allows us to experiment with different ideas. And hopefully we can learn our lesson from, the 200 years or so that, the US government has been dealing with this issue, or the thousands of years that humans have been dealing with democracy. But this is just kind of the nature of voting systems, right? Is they get more complicated, and as they get more complicated, you need more flexibility. So modular governance is like, it's not targeted at like an NFT DAO necessarily of 15 people, although it can be used for it. For example, DYCats is going to be using modular governance because it was easier for them to go and create their own UI.
Plus they're Helium, Helium based. They're like, right?
They are Helium based.
Shout out Peroni.
Yeah. Shout out to Peroni. But I think something that's flexible can also be easier to use, right? I talk about SPL Gov as this, mech with machine guns and everything else on it and a missile launcher. But like, if you don't need that, all of that stuff is very confusing to you, right? It's like, wait, but I literally just want to vote on a proposal. How do I do that? How do I make a website that does that? And so modular governance also accomplishes this use case really easily. Really, if you want to build your own custom experiences, big or small, modular governance is kind of where it's at. If the DAO itself is not your main goal, which for a lot of organizations it isn't, then you're better off going and creating it in Realms. For Helium, the DAO, we've identified the DAO as one of our core competencies. Like, that is one of the things that we care a lot about and we want to invest in. But that's, not necessarily true of like certain DeFi protocols. Like, the DAO is a means to an end. It's a means to managing risk and having people vote on parameters and stuff. But they're not going to invest a ton of resources in a custom UI for it. They just want people to be able to vote, and that's fine. So there really are kind of two ends of the spectrum here, which is why I also think that these things coexist pretty well.
It's pretty cool. I'm very intrigued now about the Helium network state. I have it now as a federal federation kind in my mind. And I'm also intrigued on what do other communities do on that governance layer? How can they give us some, if there are some examples of how are the communities like DYCats, how are they using the UI they made? What's really unique about it, which they couldn't find elsewhere, and they said, we'll build this and we need it.
Yeah, so DYCats wanted to like actually make an NFT DAO, like not like a group chat, but like actual on-chain voting for it. And the guy Peroni is this, like, he's an amazing developer, and he's great at building UI. So like he wants to build his own custom experience. Like, he doesn't want to be plug in another app. He wants you to go to DYCat's website and like be able to actually do stuff. And equally, he just wanted some of the features like multiple choice voting and things like that. So it made sense for him. He spent probably a few weeks to a few months chewing the glass of trying to get the the SPL Gov SDKs to work, and then saw I was building this, and he kind of looked at the test and was like, oh, this is like way easier. And so he hooked it up in a weekend, which is kind of the power. Is like, if you're a developer, the goal of modular governance is like, yeah, go hook it up in a weekend.
I think it's very, very important to point out that if you're a beginner, you might want to start with a monolithic approach. But if you're an advanced user, you go to modular. But then sometimes these things meet in the middle, and then it reverses the usage. So you start beginner with a monolith, and then you go to the modular systems. But then if you evolve this enough and add too many layers on top of them, you have a monolithic situation, and you start over again and again and again. So it's like a vicious cycle of, finding the best solution and the best fine tuning for your car or for your bicycle or for your monocycle sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, it's all just an exercise in like dependencies. And as a developer, your goal is single responsibility and like having things that are very easy to reason about. But you can make monoliths that are very easy to reason about as well. It's all just a matter of opinion. But I think naturally the things that come later get to build on the lessons learned from the things that came before them. So it's not really fair to compare these two, because like I'm using lessons that they're not going to be able to learn because it's all super, or use rather, because it's all super calcified, right? Like there's a whole UI that has tons and tons of features, and you can't just like go and scrap the whole thing and write a new one. But I'm hoping with more modular contracts, you can with more modular contracts and not having a big UI that depends on all of them, that you can more easily trash certain contracts and certain pieces. And I'm full well expecting people to trash a bunch of pieces of this. I want people to pick and choose, you know, there's a heap of things and they can build what they want out of it and throw out the rest. Was kind of the goal.
There was an interesting part that Wales mentioned earlier about how the Helium network state looks like or would look like. So how do you envision that based on where you guys are right now and with the modular governance coming into the mix?
Yeah, so there's like a lot of interesting things happening with that. I mean, from a tokenomics side, right, there's, you know, supply side burn versus demand side burn. Like the way the Helium system works is to use the network. So this is like demand side. You need to burn HNT to get these things called data credits, which effectively pay for your data transfer. And that's global. So that's across, you know, mobile and IoT, you know, sub networks. You use the data credits. So demand side burn is kind of spoken for, and, you know, effectively that's federal. But supply side burn, so things like, you know, the mobile network recently introduced this thing called hex boosting, which sounds super cool and complicated, but it's basically just saying, hey, like, I'm going to spend tokens to increase the earnings in this grid, which is really useful if you're like, oh, like maybe I'm going to have a conference and I want really good coverage there, so I'm going to go boost this area so that, you know, people go set up hotspots there or something like that. Well, and the question there is, to do the hex boosting, do you burn HNT to get data credits, or do you burn mobile because it's a mobile specific thing? Well, obviously the people who hold the mobile token, they probably want you to burn mobile. But the people who hold the HNT token want you to burn HNT. And so there's just super interesting questions there. I don't want to wax too much philosophical on tokenomics because I am not an expert, and also legally, you know, that gets interesting. But the discussions are super interesting. And so then you get into governance and like, how do you kind of enable voting on these discussions? And like, we have a mobile token and you have a mobile sub DAO that votes on things, and an IoT sub network that votes on things, and the HNT network votes on things. And even within those, you have working groups and like sub organizations. And how do you enable those to have transparent and open voting that is, you know, maybe separate from the main DAO, or at least not everybody wants to vote on everything. Like not everyone wants to vote on, you know, a working group adding and removing members type of thing. So there's no dearth of interesting, you know, things to work with here. But these are problems you only start to see when you get to Helium size. I mean, I think this is another thing, is we started breaking realms because I think prior to Helium coming, the largest DAO on Solana was, I think, Mango, which has like 400 or 500 or so actives.
I think it might have been the Rain.
The Imperium of Rain. Yeah,
I think it might be the Imperium of Rain that was the biggest before Helium came along. I just have a feeling that that's the one it was.
Yeah, I think he got like a couple thousand voters on that. Well, a couple thousand NFTs voting, which is not necessarily the number of wallets.
Right.
So Helium has like, I think it's like 6,000 to 10,000 wallets that are like actually going and voting. So all of the like get program account calls, like everything was just like lagging up in the, like, it was just like throwing a wrench into a system of gears, because there's just so many people involved in the Helium governance, which I actually love. Like, as a developer, it's really nice that, I mean, I came from like my own startup where I had to be like dictator and make every freaking decision. And now it's like, oh, I just like go look at the hips that the community has decided is a good idea. And like, you don't have to worry about user feedback because these things literally came from your users. But now the questions are like, okay, how do we enable that? How do we enable them to organize better? So that is kind of another goal of modular governance, is like, it's probably going to change a bunch over the next few months as we experiment with, you know, different ways of letting people vote.
Have you also added treasury management and all these like multi-sig support? Have you solved these issues? Are you using already pre-built tech, or you're building your own solutions from the beginning?
Yeah, so that stuff Helium doesn't actually need, but I added it just as an exercise of, I know all of the requirements that people are going to need. So in order to make sure that our design was actually right, I went and added those requirements. Like I needed to convince myself that this was actually easier to work with. I didn't want to have a situation where somebody came along, 6 months from now and was like, well, we need wallet support. And then I'm like, oh crap, I designed this poorly. So it does actually have support. But again, it's modular. So it's kind of like it's a plugin, right? It's like, okay, if you want a wallet for your organization, you use this organization wallet smart contract, and that allows you to execute instructions based off of proposals. And then if you want multi-sig on top of that, you should just use squads with that. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you want a multi-sig, just use squads.
I want to really dive in a bit onto the Helium stuff a bit more, if you don't mind.
Yeah, good.
Do you envision, today, I assume, there's a kind of foundation that handles, the hardcore protocol changes, even though you're taking the opinion of the holders, the people who are executing is within that group. Do you see this mirroring kind of like a Congress, a Senate? Do you expect checks and balances to emerge in these different governing bodies?
Yeah, I expect checks and balances to start to happen, and just even questions like what should be a sub-DAO vote versus what should be network-wide vote are interesting questions. At the end of the day, Foundation doesn't want to be, I think, one of the branches of government, right? Like we don't want to be the president. The only thing is, and this is this is decentralized. So if somebody wants to, vote on something and approve it and build it, that's fine. But Foundation if Foundation is going to build it, we can't build something that's illegal, right? So there are interesting considerations there, because we're operating in the real world.
You mentioned that earlier, that a proposal goes through legal to then be something to be able to vote on.
Correct. Because you could go and issue a security or something, right?
Yeah, I know.
Foundation's not going to issue we're not going to implement issuing a security, because that puts us into legal trouble. We can't just be like, well, this decentralized thing told us to do it.
So I have a certain amount of HNT. I have to have a certain amount of HNT to be able to put a proposal in front of legal.
Actually, no. So literally anybody can do it. So all the proposals are done through, and again, I might be wrong on some of these things because I'm not super deeply entrenched into the proposal process. We actually have people for that, which I love that. Anyway, so not financial advice. None of this is exactly how it works. Not legal advice. I don't know. Covering my bases. In case Josh watches.
This is all for entertainment.
Yeah, this is all for entertainment. In case Josh watches it later. But my understanding of it is literally anybody can make a pull request into the HIP repo.
Okay.
And then people will help you kind of.
The Helium improvement proposal process.
Correct. And then there's kind of a whole process around this where a Discord channel gets created for that HIP. People start actively discussing it. The Helium Foundation people help you massage it. And it's in that kind of review phase where it's going to come out like, hey, you can't do this. You can't do this in the US, or you can't do this in the EU. And so it won't go to on-chain voting when it has those problems, hopefully. But there's only so much you can do, massaging things, right? We can't just have somebody change their thing entirely to make it go to proposal, or that would make us kind of like a centralization force. So it's more just suggesting things, right? I am not sure this is true. So somebody would have to check me on this, but somebody could theoretically propose something that is illegal, but Foundation is just not going to implement it.
So basically, legal and the Foundation act as a form of signatories, but not on chain, because we've had a discussion on SPL governance about signatories and people that give the go ahead about the proposal to either be posted or be implemented, even if it succeeds. So that's kind of an analogy of the same situation. And as you described it, you guys are like steering people into the correct direction, but you're not necessarily telling them, cannot happen. You cannot do that. So I guess that's how it is, right?
Yeah, and people are like, at least in my experience, they're pretty aligned on this. Like nobody in the Helium community like wants to go do something that's illegal in certain jurisdictions. Like everybody is very interested in doing things the vanilla ways. It's just like everybody has ideas, and it's like, oh, I have this idea to do this, like rev share thing, and it's like, oh, well, you can't do that kind of rev share thing, right? But people are really, really responsive to that. They don't want to do something bad. They just want to solve problems. Yeah, it's really nice. We have actually a super active community of people that propose hips. Yeah,
so when a hip is proposed, you have like really good moderators that are going to take the hip and create a Discord channel and invite people, or this happens programmatically by itself. Like you created the system where the moment the hip is created, a Discord channel is created. The people that are interested in that know exactly what to do, because there's a lot of administration in these things. And we've also experienced the pain points where thousands of channels are created. People don't know where to look. Some channels are forgotten. How do you manage all this? You have really good moderators.
There's even a stage. There's like even a stage before that, right? So I mean, I'm in it right now. People are discussing things. There's actually like a hip discussions channel where people talk about what they're even thinking of proposing. And so like a lot of ideas get kind of shot down even in that stage by other people that are in that chat. So you don't have the type of things where it's like, did you think of this unintended consequence? It's like, well, I didn't make this not thinking of that unintended consequence because somebody already told me in the the hip discussions channel. I think it also helps that like these hips have to be very well formulated ideas. Like it needs to be formulated enough that Helium Foundation's protocol team can actually go and like implement it. So there's a little bit of a barrier to entry in terms of like you need to make sure this thing is fully fleshed out. So no, we don't really have a problem with proposal spam. There's a lot of ideas that fly around the the hip discussion chat, but that tends to filter out most of them. I don't tend to think that you need super heavy on-chain tooling to deal with these problems, which are effectively social problems, which is maybe where some people would disagree with me. But I think the on-chain part is really important for the ledger of decisions that have actually been made and preserving those decisions and making sure that those decisions were fair. How things get to the point where they're proposed on chain is something you have more flexibility to mess around with, socially. And I think eventually you can put those things on chain as people build cool tech, like, Vic sits over there building Solarplex, which I think could be really useful for DAO discussions. But talk about like the core things that you care about being there first, and then figure out the processes around everything else second. Like processes are so hard to figure out. You're better off being able to flexibly experiment with them before you calcify them.
Yeah, and I think I'm laughing a little bit, smiling, because this for me is a huge issue, that going on chain is like a little bit going to war. Like you make people pick a finalized pick sides from a finalized argument where your question might be wrong, your argument might be wrong, and you're forcing this down to the community or to the people involved. It's the last step going on chain. It's certainly not the first. It's certainly not somewhere in the middle. It's after the idea and the whole thing has been fleshed out. So going on chain is not a light decision. You need to be really sure of what you're proposing. It's easy to make enemies by going on chain.
Yeah, and to be fair, like I actually want it to be easier to take certain things on chain. Like Helium has the concept of temperature check votes, which is also kind of an interesting thing that I haven't seen elsewhere. It's like hey, like this vote doesn't actually matter for anything. Like it's not going to decide anything. We just want to see if are people even generally interested in this idea. So it's like kind of like a half-formed hip, and it's like, let's temperature check to see if the community even wants to move forward with this, so like you don't waste your effort. And I'd love to see more votes like that. And then like, you see DAOs like Monkey DAO, right? Where like they're just like voting in Discord always. And, depending on Matrica to verify it, but like that's obviously not on chain. But I think it's fairly low hanging to put that stuff on chain. And I saw, the Phase Protocol guys built this crazy forum thing for Bonk, where
Online.
the voting was like basically like Reddit style voting, was like upvote, downvote, and it was like it felt like much less like going to war than usual on-chain voting feels.
Yep,
And so I
yep.
actually would like to see,
The way you present it, it makes a huge difference. Yeah, with
yeah, the way
little
you
arrows up
present it
and
is
down is yeah, it's gentle.
the official
It's
page with the
polite.
yes and the no and the voting power and all of this stuff. It's
Comes
like,
up.
oh, I'm in the cockpit of a jet. Like this is war. So
Yeah.
yeah, the way you present it matters. And I actually would love to see even temperature check and things like monkey DAO voting go on chain. Because Solana is so cheap, frankly, that it's super easy to do that. The things that I'm not so eager to push on chain immediately is the process of how a proposal comes to be. But that is the purpose of the state controller contract, is if you want to have a super complex like proposal life cycle, I guess you would call it, on chain, you can totally do that and you can write your own contract that does that stuff. I just personally think that you're going to spend a lot of effort on something that is super likely to change.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because in my mind, I've come across lots of times that the DAO or the sub DAO needs to be agile when it comes to kind of decision making, and this is the reason that smaller groups sometimes will use multisigs instead of DAOs, instead of governance layer.
Yeah, and that is kind of, that's my point here, is like, if you want to actually formally build this in a smart contract, your process of like, okay, let's say, so there are two kinds of sign-offs, right? There's the Helium form of sign-off where like we sign off before it even gets to become a proposal. But there's the latter form of sign-off where it's like the tail sign-off, where it's like you can propose anything, the community can vote on anything, but then legal signs off on it after the proposal is already passed. Both of those are valid ways to do it. They have their own trade-offs. Do you want to implement that on chain? I'd argue like you can. In modular governance, you can take the state controller contract, you can have your own custom state controller, and you can do whatever you want with those life cycles. But at the end of the day, the state controller is just a wallet that signs something. I actually told Peroni with DY Cats this. I was like, if you want to mess with, how a proposal goes through its life cycle in a way that's like fairly flexible, you could actually just have a Web2 server control this signer that controls the proposal state and just manage this all with like a Postgres database if you wanted to, until you like actually get your shit together basically and figure out how people actually like to bring proposals through the process. Do you need a draft state? Do you need a sign-off state? Are you the US government and you need the House to vote on it, and then you need the Senate to vote on it, and then you need the president to vote on it? Figure these things out first. And then you have the ability to calcify it if you want to. But again, governance is just so elusive. There's so many different ways to implement it that I feel like having that flexibility early and then you can calcify it later is really important. Which is why I don't want to explicitly make those decisions for people. Like the proposal explicitly has custom states on it, because the only thing that I had a super strong opinion of was that it probably needed a draft state, it needs a voting state, and it needs a resolved state. Those are the only three that matter. And you could even, originally I kind of waffled on, do you need drafts? But I settled on adding draft because it's important for things attaching to the proposal, like transactions. I want to create this
Instructions in
proposal.
general.
Yeah, like I want to create this proposal and then I want to attach transactions to it. Well, I can't very well attach transactions to a proposal that's already voting. That's effed up. So you do kind of need a draft state, but everything else like vetoed, canceled, things like that, I didn't include in there because maybe Helium needs it, but other people don't. And I didn't want to pollute the code base with a bunch of things that confuse people that they don't need.
What about abstain? Did you include abstain as an option?
So abstain is an interesting one. The choices on modular governance are actually generic. It's just an array of strings basically, and you can actually put URLs on there if you want your choices to be, I don't know, the Gettysburg Address or something. But so you can have yes, no, abstain as the three choices, and it'll just work. If you want special quorum around abstain, that gets a little bit interesting. You can still implement it, but you might have to do some stuff in the state controller.
God, so
Actually-
yes, no, abstain is like a multiple choice selection, but if you want to abstain to either count towards quorum or be withheld from quorum, you'd have to do that custom.
Yeah, because you might reach quorum by having everybody voting abstain.
Yeah.
Like the word
And,
abstain doesn't mean anything until you pull in the state controller.
Yeah, depends on when the state controller is actually, if it's before or after.
Yeah, I mean, abstain, you kind of don't want that to count towards quorum, because then you could potentially trigger quorum by voting abstain. But again, that's like an opinion that I don't want to have, because somebody could have the opposite opinion, right? I mean, you can do either.
The original quorum concept was they're here, you know, are they present? Are there enough people here discussing this for us to achieve quorum? You know, now it's, are there enough people agreeing with it for us to achieve quorum? It's, you know, it's changed from.
Are there enough people actually taking a side?
Yeah, I think it's the complication comes from, you know, you're talking like original like Greek government quorum. You got like people in a room. You're like, okay, this is like, you are here. You have to like, you have to take a
say
side.
something.
You have to say something.
Direct
Whereas
democracy.
like,
Yeah.
you know, we're online, so you've got all these fucking lurkers. like, how do you count quorum? Like, you don't actually know how many people are in the room because people are lurking. And like, even if they're lurking, they're not going to necessarily click abstain because they know that that has an effect on the vote passing. So abstain is really interesting. What we're probably going to use it for at Helium is, you know, the quorum will be a vote in order to be considered valid has to have at least X weight on the choice that won. So voting no, voting abstain doesn't actually affect whether or not the choice that won will have enough weight to be considered ratified. But we will still have the abstain there because I think it's actually a really interesting data point, right? It's saying
Exactly.
You know, if you have a vote where it's like 5% yes, 2% no, and 93% I don't give a fuck. That's like
You do it. Yeah.
That's really
a message.
bad. That means that like your community, like this, whatever this vote was something that your community didn't care about, which means you are doing something wrong. And that's a signal.
Your priorities are wrong. This is what it signals.
The yes
Or maybe,
is saying,
or maybe
I will die on this hill. The abstaining is, look, I don't give a shit. Sure, yes, no, whatever. And then the no is, no, I will die on this hill. Like, that's
Yeah.
the spectrum.
I think it's also good to see your participation percentage, right? Like the abstain also tells you how many people are actually looking at the vote, including the people that don't care. So abstain is a really cool option to have, and it's a good signal to have. I don't know that in a vacuum, a high abstain percentage necessarily tells you that it was a bad vote to have. It might tell you that that vote needs to be more localized. Like that vote needed to be within a working group and not for the entire network.
That's a very good point. Or explained more, right? Like people are disciplined enough to say, look, I gotta abstain. I have no idea what happens if I press this button.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it lays in context. A certain percentage of abstain lays in context. So people might need more context, more information about what this proposal is about. And if you don't have this crystal clear when you put the proposal up for vote, I think that's one of the reasons that might lead to abstain, and that's a good data point to have as well through abstain.
I've had this question I've wanted to ask for a while about like how big Helium can get as not only a protocol, right, as a decentralized protocol, but maybe, I don't know, a network state where it's like, okay, because there's hardware, right? There's actually something touching, you know, reality there. Is there, you know, aspiration to start purchasing like buildings or lands, have a soccer team, have a national anthem, like, you know, because like I'm very much thinking about how we operate as a network state. You know, when we think about concepts like embassies, is that something that could eventually happen for Helium? Could I one day be whistling the Helium national anthem?
I don't know. That sounds Sounds very nationalist there. I'm not gonna say that it couldn't happen. People would have to vote for it, but buying land and stuff, I mean, actually that's something that the Helium network is able to avoid completely, which is really cool. You know, like you talk about Verizon going and trying to deploy 5G radio. They've got to go rent or like lease a spot on somebody's rooftop from a landlord that's trying to gouge them. There are actually entire legal departments. I know someone that's on one of these legal departments that is basically devoted to negotiating deals with landlords where they put their radios, and Helium just completely avoids that. You just like, yeah, I want to earn tokens for mining, so I'm just going to slap this on my roof. And so, like, I think that is certainly interesting for Helium, and that's why Helium is going to be much, much better at getting that last mile, and honestly, probably at a better price point, because we don't need a whole legal department negotiating these things. But, I think that there's a trade-off there, right? Which is 4G signal, which tends to come from these like giant cell phone towers. No one's putting that up in their backyard. So, like, certain things we'll be better at and certain things we won't be. 5G is just one of those things that's really good for Helium because it has not very much range. And so you actually need a lot of people putting them up and getting the last mile. And then, IoT is interesting because it has incredibly long range, but it's not that large. It's super easy for somebody to just put that in their house.
Well, I was excited to try out for the Helium basketball team, but I guess
I mean, it's a big community. There are definitely people do a bunch of meetups and stuff like that. But it's mostly just arranged through Discord, and we have Helium House and things like that. But no, we haven't purchased a sovereign island yet.
So that means Treasury constantly will be used towards research and development, paying out grants for more things like that. Like there's never a point at which Treasury is used for charity or something else that's not specific to. I would think it has to be R&D specifically, maybe marketing, but nothing like diversification, no DeFi, I hope no DeFi.
Yeah, I mean, Treasury is also kind of an interesting thing. 2 years ago, you would have thought every DAO has a treasury, but the Helium DAO doesn't, that I know of, really have a treasury, right? Like there's the Helium Foundation, and the Helium Foundation certainly has, its own treasury, which it uses to pay employees and pay out grants. And there's Nova Labs, which, is building out Helium Mobile. And they have their own funding and their own treasury. But the Helium DAO itself, it doesn't have, a treasury. The funding for implementing things is on Foundation and Nova Labs. And both of us have our own incentives to be doing these things, right? So yeah, not all DAOs necessarily have a treasury.
But you built it
Anyway.
in case we need it in the future, right?
Yeah, I built it because I think people will. Like, I think DY Cats will. Like, DY Cats is almost certainly going to have a treasury.
Are you planning on doing some kind of onboarding event in order to showcase what the governance layer can do to other? How are you going to populate the layer with network states?
Yeah, so I think this is kind of an interesting thing, which is a lot of times in crypto you have these like infrastructure plays where somebody like went and they built something and their biggest goal is, I'm going to get everybody using my governance infrastructure. But like this is actually more of like a traditional company style thing where like Facebook built React.js, but their goal wasn't to get a whole bunch of people to use React.js. They were just like, hey, this is cool.
That's what we need.
Making us build faster. Let's open source it and give it to everybody. And so that's kind of what's happening with modular governance is like, we needed it anyway. I know a bunch of other people need it. So we open sourced it. We made some docs and, hopefully people build on it. The real test for growth is just going to be what gets built on it. I think, when people see, the Helium vote site that we're building right now, and they're like, this is super fast and super easy, they're going to want to build their own. When they see what Peroni's building over there with DY Cats, they're going to want to build their own. And so people are going to see the power. It's kind of the way, Candy Machine grew in the early days of Solana. It wasn't because this massive marketing effort. It was somebody launched an NFT project on Candy Machine and it was super smooth. And it's a small community of builders. And so somebody else wanted to launch an NFT project and they're like, hey, yo, what did you use? And then they went and used Candy Machine. And I think any software that is sufficiently good hopefully will grow like that. And if it's not that good, it won't. And then it'll just be a Helium thing. And that's fine. It's not like we built this thing for profit and we're expecting to, make a bunch of money off of people using this thing. We built it because we genuinely thought it would be useful for the community. And if it's not, then the thesis was wrong.
So I know that one of the proposals I want to put forward for our DAO, for our network state, for Dean's List, is for us to be very involved with Helium, to have our own nodes, to be part of mining, also have a substantial amount of HNT. If we have that in realms, in SPL governance, will we be able to interact as a depositor and vote? Because that's something we could do, for example, with Mango. We can hold Mango and then vote on Mango proposals within SPL governance. Is that something we would be able to do?
Yeah. So to vote on Helium, you need VHNT, which you get by staking HNT for some amount of time. So what you would first do is take the HNT that's in the treasury and, via realms, you would have to go create a transaction that stakes that HNT and, have people vote and approve that. When you do that, you'll actually get back an NFT that represents your staked position, which it would also show in the DAO. So on realms, you would see your staked position. And then you can go to Helium Vote and vote using that position. That also, is a transaction that you would post to realms that people can vote on. So it's all composable. I think really the problem that you're going to run into is like there's no creating transactions on realms is not easy.
Yeah, there's only Cordelia that can do that, and even that hasn't been fleshed out completely. Would we be able to use squads to do it?
I mean, maybe in a sideways way, like if you made the realm the approver on, like the realm is the one signer on the squad, then you could go use squad's new extension that I think they're going to be making, where you can go approve, use a DApp using the extension and it actually creates a squads proposal. Ultimately, that's what realms needed. That's what Helium Vote will need eventually, or what modular governance will need eventually. That's what squads is going to need. Like, I don't understand why people haven't built this yet, but you need like a Chrome extension wallet that I can go visit DApp, and when I approve a transaction, it actually in the background goes and creates a proposal. I don't know why this doesn't exist yet. It is absolutely too much to ask people to go base 64 serialize the transaction and then copy paste it into realms and then
have it fail.
Yeah, and then have it fail. And like you're voting on something that people don't necessarily understand what they're voting on, because you have to go try and interpret that Solana transaction.
Oh, forget it, man. Don't get me started. Like,
yeah. Even the instruction is nonsensical. It's impossible to understand.
Ellipsis Labs now does the verification on some of these instructions to at least let you know that, hey, from that protocol, this is that same instruction. You can see the same thing in SoulScan, that is the official instruction from that protocol. That's the closest we've got.
But even then, it's like you can do pretty naughty things by just having bad arguments to a real program's instructions, which is another reason why Helium's model of having a multi-sig that takes care of these things, in my opinion, is actually better until we get better tooling around how can voters actually understand what is happening in this transaction. I think there was an exploit at some point, actually, where somebody made a malicious transaction that the DAO approved because voters thought it was something different. I can't remember where it was, but I remember
somewhere in SPL governance, you're saying?
No, I think it was on ETH.
On ETH? Oh, for sure, man. Everything's happened.
Yeah. But like that's super dangerous. But the point is that there's nothing on chain that would keep you guys from voting using the treasury. I don't know if Realms has features built into it to allow Realms to vote on other realms.
Yeah, no, you can. We can.
DAO to DAO action, DAO to DAO.
Yeah, that happened. It happened first time with Mango voting on a dual finance proposal. That happened like 10 days ago. That was a historic moment. So yeah, it's possible.
Yeah, so that's something that's, again, like there's not going to be a UI for it, so it would be fairly difficult. It's not impossible. It's just technical and annoying. Which I don't know. I think we just as devs need to build more things. If that's, if we get a lot of DAOs, or even really one that's doing stuff with Helium, I'm sure we can make something where on the Helium Vote UI, you can just like export the transaction in a way that realms will understand. That's probably the easiest thing to do.
Look at Dean smiling. The gears turning.
Yeah, we're all visualizing the future of DAOs. So many choice. I mean, it's the fact that the DAOs are going to have choices on governance layer, on how easy, how complicated, for introductory DAOs, really specialized DAOs. I think that's the only way to actually move forward, is to have different kind of governance layers for different missions.
I have one question before we can wrap this up. Is Solana the future of DAOs based on, our collective experience here? What do you guys think?
I hope so. I mean, I think Solana is probably one of the few chains. I'm not going to say the only chain because I'll get flamed for it, but it's one of the few chains where we can actually make voting not feel like going to war. The gas is so cheap. It's super cheap. Things like phase protocol where people were just upvoting and downvoting and it was actually an on-chain vote. Like that is not necessarily only possible on Solana, but it's definitely one of the few chains that can handle it. And I think that is hopefully the future of DAO voting, is that we're able to, do those things. But it's on us, right? Like we have to build the DAO tooling that is compelling for people to come over from other chains or from outside of crypto in general. It's like, oh, I can go use this modular governance thing and put together a sick voting system really, really easily, regardless of whether or not I was interested in doing that in Web 2 or Web 3. Like I think Web 3 products need to be so good that they stand up against Web 2 products, even if they're not. Like I don't think the user should have to care.
Yeah, the going to war analogy is a really good one, especially when you think about the cost of things. We wouldn't be able to use dual finance for our options for our airdrop if it was on Ethereum. We wouldn't be able to issue compressed NFTs as temporary business visas that we revoke and then give back and then update the metadata. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that I'm very confident where, saying that Solana is where DAOs are going to be for a while.
I've tried to DAO on EVMs. I've tried to DAO on L1 competitors. It hasn't been easy. It's not always much. It's not like it's much worse as an experience, but Solana is the go-to place for the non-financial transactions and experimentation and having all these checks and balances on chain. I'm convinced it is the chain to build DAOs. Yeah,
I think the DAOs are on, Ethereum, because if they're making a lot of financial transactions, that's where the liquidity is. But if you're a non-financial DAO, yeah, I mean, Solana is so much faster, so much cheaper, and there's a lot more flexibility in the DAO creation. Yeah, so. Forgiving. Solana is forgiving when it comes to these kind of things. And going to war argument, how many times I felt it? How many times Dean tells me, yeah, just go make a proposal. I'm like, dude, I'm not ready for this. I'm just not ready for everybody voting no, and then me having to die on some weird hill about an opinion that I'm not really passionate about. Let's not take it on chain.
So all we have to do is bridge ETH and EVM liquidity to Solana's governance systems and the directness of what Solana can offer and the governance option and tools. And then Utopia, yeah, exactly. And then we're good to go, right? We solved everything. Do cool things that don't involve needing a ton of liquidity. Like there's so many interesting things that you can create, decentralized autonomous organizations around that aren't super highly financial. Just do that. Everybody's like talking about how we bring in the liquidity in the TVL. It's like you've got this super fast chain that can do incredibly cool things that are only possible on Solana. Do things that are only possible on Solana. It's possible to have a shitload of liquidity and make money in DeFi on ETH. It's also possible to do it on Solana, but there are things that you can do on Solana that you literally cannot do on ETH. Yep. And I think high speed, cheap voting DAOs that are super forgiving is something that is probably only possible on Solana right now. It's been an amazing conversation. I think I can speak for all of us that we could keep this up for let's do hours and hours. Let's do a part 2 in the future. It's always a good time. Maybe do it after we get a bunch of HNT, so that way we can start complaining about some proposals that we're trying to pass.
Yep, and then when they keep on failing on us, we can be like, let's go back to monolithic,
I mean, it might be interesting actually to see I mean, I think Peroni is actually going to do this, but a DAO as a deployer. Like if the DAO goes and gets hotspots and then people within the DAO deploy those hotspots on behalf of the DAO, then the DAO itself will be earning mining rewards, which is kind of cool.
There you go. That's the goal.
You just like, you have to be careful about what happens with those rewards because, well, you guys aren't based in the US, so maybe you don't. In the US, like you can't do something where you like then take those rewards and go rev share them with
in
the
Europe
DAO
as well.
participants.
In Europe as well, you cannot really distribute value without effort. Let's put it like that.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah, but there are other interesting things you could do with a DAO that's deploying hotspots and then has, mining, tokens coming from that doesn't necessarily involve redistributing that to DAO holders.
Yeah, but also not really redistributing, just burning them to get the voting token and then participating. You don't need to you can immediately add them to the governance layer.
Yeah, and it's also
So-
interesting because a DAO can take like for an individual going and like locking up your HNT tokens for the max of 4 years is like kind of scary. But for a DAO, like, locking it for 4 years, maybe
It's
not
a
as-
nothing burger.
Yeah, it's not as
Yeah,
scary.
it's a natural thing in order to kind of guarantee that its longevity. Like here we are committing for a 4-year lockup, and we want to have the power and the voice. I'm kind of interested in the experiment. I would love to explore the dynamics and the implementation, and we can start small. We don't need to buy like 100,000 devices to start mining. We have 3. Neighbor of mine has 3 already deployed. We could maybe use it and experiment.
Yeah, I mean, you basically
Good
just
stuff.
have the DAO own the NFT that is the miner, and then the rewards would just go to you can permissionlessly go and use the CLI to claim those rewards into the DAO, which is pretty cool. But man, there's so much stuff that it involves like running custom smart contract transactions that Realms doesn't have a UI for this. Like it doesn't have a wallet. I said, oh, why has nobody built this yet? Good Lord. How are people running transactions on Realms right now? You just you like have a dev go form the transaction for you, basically, and then you copy paste it.
We usually
No,
we ask nicely for them to actually make the integration. So it's
exactly. And so now we have a list of integrations that is endless, and the only people that know what they do is us, because there's just a title. And
Classic.
okay, let's look at our notes. What did we require that day? Yes, we required to redeem a participation token for that whitelist. Oh, this is the instruction that was created and used only once by us.
Yeah,
So yeah, that's how we operate. Custom instructions by saying, "Hey, integrate."
Somebody needs to like fork Salmon Wallet or something and just turn it into a DAO wallet. I actually wonder if we could get the because I'm pretty sure the squads guys are building this. I wonder if you could convince the squads guys to just add Realms and modular governance support to it as well. Or
The
honestly,
cube.
if they open sourced it, I would probably do
The hero we have but don't deserve.
it. Well, I think they will. I think the squads guys open source pretty much everything, so they probably will open source it. I like those guys.
Yeah, shout out to the squad.
The squad.
Squads.
I wonder if
I
squad's
think,
upgrade authority is held by a squad.